That's just amazing.
It's a nice view.
You know, you would look, I see so many people on Zoom who have the headset and the mic in front. For your environment, that would be perfect because you would look like you're directing air traffic.
That's true.
From that position.
I would look in my element there.
Yes, Tom.
Folks, we just want to confirm that we are live on YouTube as of now. Thank you.
Thanks, Bree. Good morning, everybody. We will give it another moment, though we like to start on time here in the Finance Committee, but we'll just let people come in and then we will get started in a moment. So thank you all for being here and look forward to getting started in a moment. All right, I see my co-chair and Representative Cheeseman, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sean Scanlon. I have the pleasure of being the House co-chair of this committee. It is February 15th, and we are here this morning to hear a presentation from OPM. We are not joined this morning, unfortunately, by Secretary McCaw, who is unfortunately under the weather, but we are joined by Undersecretary Jeff Beckham and Tom Fiore, who many of you know is the section leader for revenue at OPM. We will be hearing a presentation from them, and certainly then we'll open it up to questions, first by the chairs, then the ranking members, and then the committee membership in general. I would say that there are many members who have questions about things going on at OPM right now. And I know that those questions are important. And I think that there should be times that we can find answers to those questions as a committee. Today is not that time. Today is a time for us to hear from these leaders at OPM about the budget. And then, Senator Fanfara and I will be communicating at another point about when we can try to get the questions that you may have answered about other things that are happening right now. But I would ask of you to keep your comments related to the presentation today and nothing more than that. With that, Senator Fanfara, any comments from you?
Briefly, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Good morning, and good morning to everyone. Welcome back. It's a cold day, and hopefully by the time we're done, we expect it'll be a lot warmer, and which always makes me happy. But in particular to my co-chairman, Representative Scanlon, and ranking members, Senator Martin, Representative Cheeseman, and all the members, want to wish Secretary McCaw a speedy recovery, and just say briefly that we will be imposing the 5-minute rule that all of you are familiar with, but if you have forgotten, it's for questions and answers included 5 minutes, so that we can give those at the end of the line an opportunity to not only speak to the representatives from OPM and to the chairs and ranking members, but to all the members. It's intended to be informative. I anticipate and expect that your questions will try to get at things that we all would want to know better, and we should have the opportunity to ask those questions with as many members here as possible. So that's the reason, and you know that after everyone's asked a question, if you want to come back and ask a question again, you're entitled to do that. We're not trying to stifle debate or interaction. It's just a matter of fairness to everyone in the process. So, and the committee, our new committee administrator, Bree Wolf, will be, and Christina Penn will be administering that for us. So, forewarned is forearmed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And I was going to introduce her a little bit more formally after we hear from Representative Cheeseman, but we can certainly do so now. We're honored to be joined today by Bree Wolf, who on her second day on the job is already working to get a nice hearing together. She replaces Tom Spinella, who many of you know was our administrator for a few years and did a great job. He has left the LOB to become a teacher, which is great, and we're happy for him. Sad to see him go, obviously, but really happy to have Bree here today. And Christina Penn, who is the clerk and also my legislative aide, is going to be working very closely with Bree this session to make sure everything goes smoothly as always. With that, Representative Cheeseman for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Scanlon. Thank you, Senator Fanfara. And I'm glad you welcomed Bree. I look forward to her running a tight ship, as Senator Fanfara and you like. I want to extend Senator Martin's regrets. He's unable to attend this hearing, but he did ask, I know we're being recorded, if one wants to see this later, where one might access it. So if we can just put that that information out there, and I look forward to hearing what our friends at OPM have to tell us today. Thank you very much, Chair Scanlon.
Thank you, Representative. And we will make the video available for folks as soon as we have it. Bree can send it around to the committee, and anyone who missed it obviously can see it. I believe we're also on CTN right now. Bree, is that the case? So you can access the on-demand feature of CTN. Last thing from a housekeeping perspective, we have our first meeting of the session, committee meeting of the session this Friday at 10 a.m. We expect that just to be, a typically short meeting to raise some concepts, and we'll keep you posted of future meetings and public hearings after that. So without further ado, Undersecretary Beckham and Mr. Fiore, the floor is yours. I believe we'll do some screen sharing and can pull your presentation up. And again, please hold your questions until the end. Once we finish, use the raised hand function, and I will call on folks as I see them, and we will go from there. So without further ado, take it away, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the opportunity to share Governor Lamont's midterm budget adjustments, recommended adjustments as they relate to matters within the cognizance of your committee. As you all will know, this presentation we have for you today is a slimmed down version of a presentation that Secretary McCaw gave to the Appropriations Committee last week, as well as to the press. So much of this has been written about. And of course, we were able to make this available to you yesterday afternoon. So you will have seen these slides before. I'll try not to read all of them. I'll try to move as briskly through them as I can so that we can get to your questions. We are in a much better position today than we were when Governor Lamont took office. We've had 3 consecutive years of budget surpluses, and we're anticipating large surpluses in the current fiscal year and in fiscal year 23. We, very importantly, have had our first credit rating upgrade in 20 years, something we're very proud of and we should all be proud of. A lot of good work has gone into that achievement, including work by the legislature 5 years ago with the 2017 budget, which put in place some fiscal controls that have contributed to that. We have recently been able to make supplemental pension payments in the range of $1.6 billion to pay down that long-term obligation that has been a chronic problem for our state. We've been able to expand eligibility and access to a variety of essential services. We've made historic investments in our municipalities. And as everyone I think knows by now, we have been a national leader in the response to the coronavirus pandemic. There's a difference in how we've been handling our business, and it's working. We're going to give you a budget overview. Some of this obviously is in the purview of the Appropriations Committee, but we feel it's important to set the stage for the discussion of the revenue items as well as the where we are with the capital budget. So our first slide here gives you a 100,000-foot view of the changes we're making in the all funds budget for fiscal year 23. First column there shows you what we enacted last year in terms of the numbers in each of the funds that we have. The second column is the net adjustments that the governor is proposing, and a new number of, if adopted, is shown in the third column there. We're showing a percentage year-over-year growth of 2.4% from 22 to 23, modest increase to reflect some of the challenges and the needs that we need to meet for our state. We do have a new cap calculation. As you know, as we move through time, the spending cap calculation changes based on various formulas, and we are still below in FY23 the spending cap by some $5.6 million. The next slide focuses on the general fund, one of our several funds, but it's the largest by far, and it's the source of most of the spending and services that the public is familiar with. The number I'll draw your attention to on this slide is the surplus number that we're projecting for FY22, about $1.483 billion. We are proposing in the rows beneath that to indicate what the governor recommends we do with that surplus this year. We're going to reduce our reliance on the federal ARPA funds for revenue replacement. We're relying to the tune of about $560 million to fund the balance for FY22. We will move all of that into spending on short-term, we hope mostly one-time spending items. We will then use surplus for fiscal year 22. We were proposing to use some of it in the next row there to the tune of about $300 million to fund what we anticipate will be impacts from the collective bargaining that we are at the table on even as we speak. There will be some adjustments we'll have to make to our personnel costs, and we are anticipating needing some funds to be able to carry those agreements out. The next several lines detail some transfers and carry forwards that we're going to have to do to facilitate some of the spending recommendations that we would have detailed to Appropriations Committee last week. We talked to them about the opportunity that the federal government made available in the ARPA Act for home and community-based services, some new investments that they're going to allow us to make using some federal funds over the next 3 years. In order to carry that out, we've got to transfer about $83 million from FY22 to FY23. We've got some carry forward and revenue transfers for other items that we detailed with appropriations last week. We are leaving about $462 million in fiscal year 22 for deposit into our budget reserve fund, continuing our string of being able to run surpluses and make those available for the budget reserve fund purposes. The next two columns there show you what our appropriations will be with those recommended adjustments. And what the revised recommended FY23 budget will look like. We still have balance after all is said and done, and after we apply the revenue cap, again, a product of the 2017 historic budget adjustment bill that year. We have to apply a revenue cap to unappropriated, or I'm sorry, revenue above the forecast, and that leaves us with balance of $16 million. Next slide gives a little more detail on the general fund. We break out the consensus revenue revisions there in the second column. We're showing about $873 million from the consensus revenue that we do with your Office of Fiscal Analysis in November and January. We're showing additional revenue, additional resources available. The next column indicates some technical adjustments that we have to make every year to annualize certain costs. Primarily, this is the aforementioned home and community-based services and substance use disorder waiver monies that we will be transferring in order to make them available over the next 3 fiscal years to take advantage of that opportunity to expand services in those areas under the federal law. So we will need to increase appropriations by that number there, the $263 million that you see in the technical updates column. Governor's also proposing policy changes that we account for in that 4th column there. The $325 million is the revenue policy changes, and about $274 million is the expenditure policy changes. And the final column shows you what the recommended revised budget will look like in terms of the overall numbers. Again, showing that we are in balance with $16 million left over. We are showing on the revenue, this is the revenue detail, projected FY23 revenues. You're showing in the first line there what we estimate current law would yield in terms of revenue to the state. We're showing you on this slide we're reducing, as I mentioned earlier, our reliance on the ARPA funds actually in this fiscal year, this coming fiscal year as well, by $250 million. In the previous slide, we indicated how much we were moving out of 22. We are reducing by $250 million in FY23 our reliance on ARPA funds. That will still, in the note there at the bottom, it does indicate we still will have about $945 million in federal funds for revenue replacement in FY23. Our first revenue recommended adjustment that the governor is proposing is detailed there in the second line. It's a $70 million item. It's cost to the general fund. Attributable to his proposed expansion of the property tax credit, the full credit to $300. The next line indicates a $53 million item, which is a governor's proposal to accelerate to what we call full eligibility for the property tax credit. What that simply means is we'll be dropping the restrictions that are currently under the law that were due to be phased out next year around age and around whether or not you have dependent children. Those restrictions will go away, and they'll be available to everyone who meets the income limits. There are still income limits as to whether or not you can access the property tax credit. But the changes we propose will be a $53 million item in FY23. The next line is the pension and annuities exemption we're proposing to accelerate. The governor's proposing to accelerate to 100% in the current tax year. That's being phased in over a number of years. I think we're accelerating that one by 3 years to full availability for pensions and annuities income. That's going to be a $43 million cost to the general fund in FY23. We're showing that in that line item. We are proposing changes to the current student loan tax credit program, whereby businesses may make payments against employees' student loans, and they get a tax credit for that against the corporation tax or the insurance company's tax. It's currently available to those who refinance through CHESLA. The governor's proposing to make it available to all CHESLA borrowers who get some of their loan payments made by their employer as a condition of their employment. That's about a $10 million item we're showing in that line item. Again, the transfer of the Medicaid revenue for the home and community-based service initiative is shown. The captive insurers initiative, that is back, I think, for the 3rd year. This committee will be familiar with that proposal. It's been before you before. This is effectively a tax amnesty program to try and incentivize captive insurers to domicile or to re-domicile in our state. As you know, captive, we'll talk about that in a few slides, actually. We have a detail on that. So the total revenue changes will be a $325 million item. We're showing you there what the new revenue total will be, a little over $22 billion for FY23. Just to highlight a few of the expenditures, this is mostly appropriation side items that they will have seen last week, but we're showing you this principally to show you the line that has the $160 million. That is how we are effectuating the motor vehicle tax cap that you may have read about that the governor's proposing. We'll have a slide or two about that in a minute, but it will cost $160 million to increase the appropriation to the tax grants program so that the towns are made whole, kept whole for the loss of the revenue attributable to reducing the mill rate cap from 45 to 29 for motor vehicles. Also of interest to this committee, I think on this slide would be, we have some revised debt service requirements. We did a little bit better on the debt service line item by $27 million, attributable mostly to a favorable interest rate environment as well as some timing of sales. Those are the highlights of the finance items on this slide. We'll move to the transportation fund next. Just some highlights where we are with the numbers in that fund. We are projecting to end this current fiscal year with a cumulative balance of a little over $500 million. You can see the revenues and the expenditures projected out of that fund for the coming fiscal year 23, going to leave us with an operating balance of $300 million and a cumulative balance of $814 million. This is considerably higher than we were several years ago. Transportation fund continues to be healthy at the moment. Next slide gives some detail on our budget reserve fund. As everyone knows, we've had very high, historic high numbers in our budget reserve fund in recent years. We have a law on the books since 2017 that provides for what we call a waterfall. That is to say, when you get over 15% of your general fund number in the budget reserve fund, you then make those excess revenues available to the treasurer, who can deposit them in pension funds and has done so the last 2 years to both the state employees retirement system and the teachers retirement system. We reached the 15% threshold at the end of 2020, expected to remain at that level through the end of the coming fiscal year. As I indicated, we have recently transferred about 1.6 billion to unfunded liabilities. We're projecting that we'll be able to make available 1.2 billion for those kinds of transfers at the end of the next fiscal year. Moving to the heart of this presentation, I think for the Finance Committee would be the governor's recommended adjustments on taxes. At a time when we are experiencing surpluses, the governor believes it's time to make good on his commitment that he's made over several years to give some property tax relief. So the first slide details our the governor's property tax credit proposals. As I mentioned, we propose to accelerate by 1 year full eligibility to taxpayers who meet those income requirements detailed there for single filers and joint filers. The credit phases out if you're in that range there, and of course above those ranges, the credit is not available to you. But this impact is going to be a $53 million item. We think it's going to increase by 500,000 taxpayers, the number of people who benefit from this particular item. We're also increasing the full credit amount from 200 to 300. As you know, over the years, this credit amount has ranged between 1 and 500, depending upon where we were with the budget that year and what the General Assembly and past governors have decided to do about that particular item. But we think that we're ultimately going to increase that from 200 to 300, and that will benefit about 1 million taxpayers who have some use for the property tax credit. The pension and annuities initiative is our next slide. We are accelerating by 3 years the phase in of the exemption for pension and annuities income. We expect that to be revenue loss of about $43 million in FY23, but by FY26, it's already baked into our consensus forecast. It was already scheduled to be 100% by then, so it won't be a revenue loss in the out years. It does have some income limits. Single filers with AGI of less than 75,000, joint filers with less than 100,000 can qualify for the pension and annuities exemption. It was originally passed as part of the 2017 bipartisan budget. We are not making changes to the expansion of IRA income exemption. That is scheduled to be phased in over 4 years, starting, I think, in the current tax year. This pension and annuities exemption acceleration, we expect to benefit about 250,000 taxpayers. The student loan tax credit is detailed on the next slide. Current law allows employers to take a 50% tax credit for amounts paid against an employee's student loans. As I mentioned earlier, this is restricted to refinanced loans under CHESLA. Governor proposes to expand this to all CHESLA borrowers. There is a maximum on the credit that the employer can realize. It's $2,625 per employee per income year. It's taken against either the corporation tax or the insurance company's tax. But we are proposing, as indicated near the bottom of the slide, to make this a refundable tax credit for those businesses with sales of less than $5 million. So if they don't have a tax liability, they nevertheless can get a refundable credit. We're hoping to leverage some private sector dollars to help out with the student loan debt issue. We think it's going to be a revenue loss of $9.4 million. We note that we currently have some 32,000 CHESLA borrowers. The Captive Insurers Initiative is detailed on the next slide. As I indicated, this has been before you before. We haven't made it all the way through it. Previous years, it was an agency proposal by Department of Insurance, essentially to stimulate economic activity by, as I said, domiciling or re-domiciling those captive insurers back to the state. It's effectively a tax amnesty program. They currently have a tax liability to the state, but we would waive their tax penalties if they address payments owed in the last 3 years. They will still pay the interest, but we will eliminate tax liabilities for periods prior to 2019. It does have a revenue impact. We think in the first year, about $7.5 million will be realized with some smaller amounts in the ensuing fiscal years. Hoping to get this particular item over the finish line, probably more for the economic activity and making the state an attractive place for businesses than for the relatively modest revenue increase we're going to get from it. You've heard quite a lot over the last week or so, 2 weeks, about the governor's proposal to lower car taxes. This is a very visible tax paid by everyone. We get a separate bill for it every year. Governor's proposing to lower an existing statutory cap of 45 mils down to 29 mils. We think this will affect about 1.7 million vehicles, 1.7 million vehicles in 103 towns, including 20 of our 25 most distressed municipalities. As I indicated, it will require an increase in the appropriation to the tax grants program of 160 million above the current appropriation, and it will apply to passenger, commercial, and combination vehicles. And on the next slide shows those 103 towns and their current mill rate. We will be affecting all of these towns with this particular proposal to make good on the governor's commitment to reducing the burden of the property tax on our residents. The next slide begins to describe the process that we had to go through this year to come up with recommendations and that the governor had to make decisions on with regard to what kind of a tax package we would put out there that he would recommend. We were limited by the federal ARPA rules. I think everyone's heard by now that in taking the federal funds, we are subject to Treasury guidelines as to how we may use them. We are not supposed to use them to cut taxes unless we offset those taxes with either spending cuts or tax increases, or we risk losing some of the federal funds. We've show you there in the first set of rows state tax breaks that are limited by those U.S. Treasury rules, and they add up to 175 million in the next fiscal year. Below that line are the non-state level tax break, the mill rate cap, which is a local property tax break that we're funding through an expenditure item, again, increasing the appropriation to the tax grants that makes the town wholes. The total tax cut package is $335 million. It was a blend of local and state tax relief to try and stay under those federal tax rules, which we'll talk about in a slide, a couple slides down. But to sum up the governor's tax relief proposals, it's honoring his commitment to property tax relief. It's providing tax relief to very tangible and visible taxes especially with regard to the car tax. We think we're going to make the state more competitive by retaining retirees. We've had a bipartisan commitment to reducing taxes on our retirees to keep families here in the state. We think we're going to be leveraging business dollars to address that student loan burden, as I talked about earlier. And we have been very careful to calibrate these proposals to minimize the potential for losing the federal funds that we are using this year. So we've undertaken, the governor's undertaken tax relief that we think is responsible in terms of its magnitude, and at a time that we are beginning to see revenue growth. To talk for a minute about the federal Treasury rules on the ARPA, use of the ARPA funds. There are several hundred pages in both the interim rule and the final rule that detail what states have to do, or what limitations they have to abide by in terms of tax cuts if they're going to use the federal money. The tax cut limitations do not apply to expenditures, and they don't apply to local governments. So that, with that in mind, that helped us calibrate the recommendations to the governor and calibrated his decision in terms of what to recommend to you. We have a combination of initiatives on both the revenue and expenditure side to minimize of loss. And we're going to describe some of the tests that the federal government provides for in the rules. That starts on the next slide. The rules invite you to first apply what's called a de minimis test. That is tax cuts that total 1% or less of your all funds budget would be acceptable without further review. In the case of our all funds budget, which is about $24 billion, that means that our 1% de minimis rule is about $247 million for fiscal year 23. As you know, since we have some previously enacted tax cuts, those count against us. It's not just the tax cuts we're going to initiate this year, it's tax cuts on the books that were passed after a certain date that roll forward. So $68 million in tax cut room under the de minimis rule has already been enacted. So for fiscal year 23, we have about $179 million of room. That explains on the previous slide why our total state tax cut number is $175 million. We were trying to stay under that 179. That figure will drop to lower rates in future years by operation of the de minimis test and by operation of the fact that we will have enacted these tax cuts and they'll be moving forward. If you fail the de minimis test, you have to move on to an organic revenue test. The organic revenue test is defined as that revenue that comes in over the pre-pandemic year, the last pre-pandemic year, which was fiscal year 19, adjusted for inflation in each fiscal year thereafter. So if you come in at revenues above that baseline number, adjusted for inflation, you can use all of that for tax cuts. However, based on our latest consensus revenue forecast from January, a forecast that we do a couple times a year with, I think about 4 times a year with the Office of Fiscal Analysis, we do not believe revenue growth will be sufficient to pay for tax cuts. We will have an opportunity in April, again with OFA, to reevaluate that number and see where we are with organic revenue growth. One tricky thing about the federal rules is they will not determine compliance with these rules until after the conclusion of your fiscal year. So if you sail a little too close to the rocks, you could be in trouble. So we've tried to be conservative about this, and we would invite you to be as well. We're going to detail some of the recommended spending. This is approach side matters, but we thought this committee would be interested because these are the sorts of investments that normally would be part of the capital budget. But in making these expenditures using federal funds under ARPA, we're going to be able to avoid making bond authorizations or bond allocations. The first category is broadband and technology. Federal government's been making a lot of money available in various acts that they've passed in the last couple of years for broadband. It's clearly the infrastructure of the 21st century, or among the most important ones. We've got about $20 million is going to be made available to expand the Connecticut Education Network. As many of you know, that's the network that has connected our towns and schools and libraries with fiber optic cable over the last many years. We're going to finish that project and connect the remaining libraries, councils of governments, and towns who are not yet connected to the network, and redirect some fiber connections currently attached to public safety digital network and attach them directly to the Connecticut Education Network. We're going to make some money available to the charter schools to provide some parity with the public schools by giving them access as well to the Connecticut Education Network's high-speed internet service. We're going to make available $38.8 million in the capital Projects Fund portion of ARPA to bolster the capacity and the resiliency of the Connecticut Education Network. And we're going to add to some monies previously allocated by the General Assembly last year to build out from street to curb to the businesses and residences for low-income residents, especially, and multifamily dwellings. Going to have a total commitment there of $14 million when it's combined with previously allocated funds. And additionally, for those projects to expand broadband service to underserved areas, when combined with last year's allocation, we're going to be up to a $24 million total for that project. And finally, on this slide, we show that we're planning to use $23 million of ARPA funds to provide our rail commuters with onboard high-speed internet access on the commuter trains. Next set of slides details some monies were being made available under the federal funds for economic assistance and economic development opportunities. We've got monies being made available on the next slide, detail 43 million or so to DRS to make economic assistance payments in the this fiscal year to individuals who are EITC eligible. You'll recall, and is indicated at the bottom of this slide, in December, the governor made available about $75 million in expiring coronavirus relief funds to economic support payments to EITC eligible households, equivalent to increasing their EITC payment from 23 to 41% of the federal credit. That impacted about 200,000 households. We're going to make available an additional $42.25 million to make an additional economic assistance payment in 22 to those lower income households. As everyone knows, the state EITC is a piggyback on the federal. If you qualify for the federal, we give you an additional percentage. If you qualify, if you file the federal and you get the federal credit, the state will also give you a credit based on a percentage of the federal. Next slide details the state's continuing commitment to business growth. We're going to make available $20 million of ARPA funds to support the Innovation Corridor, which is part of DECD's Economic Development Action Plan. This is an allowable use or an authorized use for the Community Investment Fund, which you'll recall this committee approved last year, or the General Assembly approved last year. We're going to instead use $20 million to support the Innovation Corridor, which was a use of that fund as well. We're making available, building on the success of last year's program, some money to make free admission to popular venues available, as well as an additional $5 million for free bus service on the weekends during the summer between Memorial Day and Labor Day to allow folks who use our bus services to get to those popular venues. We're setting aside $15 million for the legislature to identify investments in water infrastructure, parks, outdoor spaces, and broadband access and other essential infrastructure. And finally, there is a line item for DECD to make to have a presence at the PGA event in the Travelers Championship to do economic development activities and networking with businesses. In the area of other initiatives, housing continues to be an important issue that we make capital investments in this state. We're making a substantial new commitment this year and $70 million to expand resources for lead abatement and remediation of our older housing stock, particularly in the urban areas of our state. Lead poisoning, especially of children, is a chronic problem, retards, holds back kids in terms of their development and in terms of their performance in life. And it's a commitment that the governor is making to deal with that issue. This, combined with some of the monies being made available to DPH for lead service line replacements, will go a long way to dealing with that very difficult problem. We've got $50 million being made available to support and invest the creation of additional affordable housing, continuing as well in our capital budget. We have authorizations available for affordable housing. We've had a decade-long commitment to building more affordable housing in this state, and we will continue that going forward. In the general fund, we've made some provisions to reduce reliance on bond funds to support operating expenses. $2 million is being made available to the Congregate Operating Subsidy Program, which is some state-supported elderly housing for elderly and disabled individuals. and provides services related thereto. They have been relying on funds from this revolving loan fund. We're proposing to let that loan fund go for capital investments as it was meant to, and reduce reliance on it for the operating. We're also making available funds and a position to support administration of the Department of Housing's bond-funded initiatives, again, reducing reliance on bond funding to support administrative functions. We've heard a lot about the federal infrastructure bill, the IIJA. The next couple of slides detail our plans to deal with that issue. It looks like over 5 years, we think we're going to get something like $6 billion of new federal infrastructure funds. It's a larger plussed up version of what we are used to getting in terms of our transportation, highway and bridge program. This slide details a number of line items that we expect to be coming from the federal government, large sums over the next 5 years, including, as I indicated, highway programs, bridge replacement, public transportation, water infrastructure, broadband coverage, airport infrastructure, expansion of the electric vehicle charging network, protection against wildfires, and protection against cyber attacks. So an expanded infrastructure commitment from the federal government that we're going to have to prepare for. We're going to have to hire some staff in the near term, particularly at DOT, to get ready to make use of all of this money. DEP is also going to have to staff up. We're making available $1.8 million for 53 positions at DEP to take advantage across multiple funds that they have to support some increased permitting activity around all these projects, these infrastructure projects, as well as to provide technical assistance associated with agency and municipal investments. That takes us to our capital budget. We are proposing this year, this is a midterm adjustment, so we're proposing to add to the capital budget that you passed last year. You provided for authorizations in the biennium of about $1.9 billion by adding $165 million in new general obligation bond authorizations. We're going to increase that total to about $2.1 billion. The first item here indicates that $75 million of this is what we estimate we'll need to make available from GO bonding in order to provide the state match for those projects that are coming to us under the federal infrastructure bill. Federal government will be making available a large sum of money, but the states are required to match some percentage of that. This $75 million in fiscal 23 will be the first year, the initial year match towards what we, as I indicated, we think will be about $6 billion over 5 years. These funds are going to be used for a variety of purposes, as I've detailed before: the water infrastructure, electric vehicle charging improvements, resiliency for climate change. The next new item that we're proposing is $60 million for the Department of Correction to make some improvements to the prisons and to address some deferred maintenance projects. We have several projects outstanding at the DOT, and they have to make some changes, make some improvements to their facilities. Making some additional monies available to DEEP for infrastructure improvements at the state parks. And we have $15 million in capital equipment purchases to continue to help us to address the state's IT equipment needs. In terms of our infrastructure needs coming down the pike in the next couple of years, the chart on the right there details where we expect to get the federal match funds from. For DOT, the first two items, DOT will be able to get formula-based infrastructure funds from the federal government. And the match that we propose to use there is $80 million in general obligation bond authority that the agency has already. You've made available GO bond authority to DOT. They've got some existing capacity there, and they'll be using $80 million of that capacity to match for the formula grants. For the competitive grants that DOT expects to be eligible for, we're going to carry forward and use $100 million of the STF cumulative balance that I talked about earlier. We'll be using $100 million of what's in the fund already available. That leaves, you'll see, about $60 million for DEEP and DPH that we'll need to figure out a way to match. You'll see there in line 8, there's the $60 million, and then we built in a $15 million contingency in case more might be needed. That's how we got to the $75 million of new bond authorizations for infrastructure match purposes. Of note, you'll see the last line of the slide there. For broadband, the federal government didn't require a match. We expect to be getting about $137 million for broadband investments that will not require a state match. So the other agencies there are listed with what we expect to get, what we expect to be able to spend it for. And those are the principal agencies that we expect to have the infrastructure responsibilities: DOT, DEEP, and DPH. Next slide summarizes what we're recommending in terms of adjustments to special transportation, special tax obligation bonds under the STF. We're not making any recommendations for changes. We think the adopted budget has new authorizations for FY23 in the $929 million range. And this will ensure the state continues to invest in its transportation infrastructure. We have existing authorizations that will provide adequate matching funds for the federal programs within the infrastructure bill to take advantage of what we think will be about $2.6 billion for transportation purposes over the next 5 years. And as I indicated, we're going to carry forward $100 million to assure that we have that match for those competitive grant programs. That takes us to the end of our slide presentation. Just wanted to say that the governor's budget proposal is being presented at a time when we're beginning to see some good things happening in our state. We've honored our commitments. It doesn't sacrifice the future for short-term gain. It's been carefully calibrated to make sure that we don't put in jeopardy those federal funds that we've been making use of. And we think the tax breaks will be make the state more affordable, be real impactful relief to taxpayers. And we're going to prepare our workforce for the jobs of the next decade, positioning the state to continue our growth, continue our success. And under the governor's leadership, we're doing business differently and we're doing it better. We thank you for the opportunity to present these proposals to you, and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary Beckham. I will just kick off with a quick question, and then we'll turn it over to my co-chair and then the ranking member on the ARPA tax guidelines. As I know, this is interesting to both sides of the aisle here. As you know, Undersecretary Beckham, there is a lot of contention around that, and 13 states successfully filed a lawsuit last fall that a district court sided with them on, that the states cannot be subject to that kind of guidance from the federal government. I assume that that will what the OPM position is on whether or not they believe that there are consequences of not following those guidelines, because it does not necessarily seem crystal clear either to my interpretation or certainly those 13 states that there are real penalties for not following those guidelines. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I can tell you that our tack in preparing recommendations for the governor and his tack in making decisions were to abide by the Treasury guidelines as we read them and understood them. To the extent that there are court decisions that will further interpret those rules or give us better guidance, we will certainly be monitoring that and seeing where that goes. But we have erred on the side of caution, and we interpreted the rules as we read them and as we got guidance from U.S. Treasury. I don't think I have anything more to say about that. I haven't analyzed those court cases, but I expect that we, along with OFA, will be having a robust discussion around that as we move forward.
Thank you. Senator Fonfara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Normally I would defer to others and speak at the end, but I'll be brief in my question. Thank you, Jeff, for your presentation. I just want to ask a question. I'm not opining on my position regarding your tax cut proposals or the governor's proposals. That will happen as we move along. But with respect to our responsibility, what I think we all ought to take seriously, which is commitments that we make today ought to be sustained going forward, unless you intend to sunset the tax cuts after a year, because 2024, as you know, in your office, in the Office of Fiscal Analysis, has projected a nearly $400 million deficit. This will add to that substantially. Again, not opining on the value of the tax cuts at all, just because we have that responsibility. And I know it's unusual for the legislature to commit to something and then back away. That's rarely ever happened. But to make sure we stay true to that tradition, what do you anticipate? How will these tax cuts be paid for in the out years?
Well, Senator, I will tell you that what OPM does and what the governor does in the second year of a biennium is present midterm budget adjustments to you for your consideration. What we have is a plan for spending in FY23. We will obviously have to present a plan to you about this time next year for the next biennium, which will start with FY24 and FY25. I was reminded before this meeting that we do revenue consensus forecasts with your Office of Fiscal Analysis, I think 3 or 4 times a year. There'll be multiple opportunities between now and the end of this fiscal year to see where we are in terms of our revenue needs and our expenditure needs. A lot can happen in a year. We have not proposed a plan yet for 24 and 25, and I wouldn't want to prejudge that for the governor or for you. I can tell you we chop the wood that we have in front of us, and what we have in front of us is to give you a plan for FY23. Every year we have to make adjustments. I've been around state government for about 30 years, and for most of that time, we've always had structural budget deficits in the future. It's a chronic problem for our state. We're a high tax and high spending state, and we have to deal with that every year. It's a lot of moving parts in the budget, and you've alluded to some of the difficulties and some of the pieces of the puzzle that we have to deal with every year. But you're quite right, and that is something we bore in mind, by the way. We've tried to minimize on the expenditure side, those expenditures that we're going to build in ongoing programs. We were trying to use one-time revenue for one-time expenditures to the greatest extent possible. And we tried to calibrate, as I said in the presentation, a modest but impactful set of tax relief proposals that are certainly manageable in this year. And you're quite right, we'll have to make them manageable in the out years or adjust them accordingly.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'll just say that when we vote for something and we tell our constituents that we've done something, and then if a year later we say, oh, well, things aren't as rosy and we have to pull that back, it doesn't go over very well. I'm sure you understand that. Secondly, real quick under my time, you're projecting an increase in for what we authorize in bonding. How much of what we authorized in 22 have you allocated?
That is a allocation plan question. My colleague Brian Tassinari may be on the line with that detail. If not, I can certainly get you that detail shortly. We've had a couple of bond commission meetings in the current fiscal year. Where we are in the allocation plan, I don't have that figure to hand, but as you know, we allocate not just current year authorizations, but prior year authorizations as well. The amount attributable to FY22 authorizations that we have so far expended is a number I'd have to get for you. Unless Brian's on the line and wants to chime in.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm here. Senator, we've allocated about $1.4 billion since the start of fiscal year 22.
And out of what was the authorized amount?
Well, those came from multiple pots of money, so it could be both fiscal year 22 authorizations, but also prior enacted authorizations. So far,
it looks like there's a good amount of headroom there.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Cheeseman, then we'll go into members of the committee.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair Scanlon. I have some questions, Jeff, about the, I guess the 2022 and 2023 adjustments for the collective bargaining and then wage increases. I see, what is it, 305.4 for the collective bargaining impact and 47.4 in the following year. There seems to be a real discrepancy here. Is that linked to one-time payments in the first year? If you could just expand on that, please.
My colleague Paul Potamianos is on the line. He may have some detail on that number.
Sure. So hi, I'm Paul Potamianos. I'm the Executive Budget Officer for OPM. We can't get into too much detail about negotiations that are still underway. But what I can tell you is that there are some components that are being discussed that would be one-time in nature, and others that would be ongoing, if you will. So there is a portion of those funds would be utilized or anticipated to be utilized for those pieces that would hit during fiscal year 22 that might be of a one-time nature. And also to back up just a bit, the current contracts expired last July 1st. So any agreement that would be reached would be retroactive to July 1st. So we anticipate that there's going to be some need to support wage changes that would cover the entirety of fiscal year 22, as well as any components that would be applicable for fiscal year 23, both one-time in nature, whether they be one-time payments of some sort, as well as any enduring wage increases.
Okay, and does the governor's, do your budget adjustments take into account pending retirements? We know we're looking at that 2022 or retirement cliff. Have you factored these into your figures?
Yes, we have. In fact, a portion of those funds, portion of what we have proposed, both through the general fund and as well as our allocations of surplus dollars in the future, would cover anticipated payouts of accrued leave that potential retirees would be owed upon retirement.
And I know the CREATES initiative, there is a certain amount built in for savings that were forecast because of changes that might be made. Have you looked at that again and altered or increased or decreased your projection of how much the state might save by implementing some of those recommendations? Because I know on, I guess the 6 to 8 year plan, it was forecast that if all the recommendations were implemented, we could see a savings of 800 to 900 million. And I just wondered how that was playing out as you look at the numbers going forward.
We have not proposed any alterations to what the adopted biennial budget assumed as far as savings for the CREATES initiative. I would say that there's a piece of those savings that were revenue related, which we believe are on track. A portion that were expenditure related. The largest piece of it was prison closure, and we're on track with that component. The other components of expenditure savings, we are in the process of sort of regrouping on some of them. We proposed some dollars, a portion of which out of surplus, to help us achieve some of those. For example, one of the initiatives was to help pay off some of our historical workers' compensation claim backlog to help pay some of those off, which would reduce future budget pressure. So we've proposed putting some resources into the budget to help us do that, which would help satisfy one of the recommendations that came out of that CREATES report. Okay,
and final question, because I'm sure I'm getting to the end of my time. The new positions being created in DOT and DEEP, I guess it's 206 and DOT and 53 in DEEP, a portion being paid for out of the federal dollars. Are these short-term positions? Are these filling positions that are vacant? Are these new positions? And once the federal money is exhausted, how are we factoring in maintaining these workers? Because obviously that's going to have an effect on the budget if the revenue supporting them goes away.
The DOT positions are largely part of the headcount already. This is simply needing to staff up and hire those 206 positions. The DEEP positions are new positions that we're making available funds to hire them. In terms of their permanence, they're all largely permanent. We expect, though, there will be attritional changes as we go through time. You've alluded to the retirements that are coming. We don't expect the overall headcount to increase by that much in the out years. As I indicate, the DOT ones are already on budget. The DEEP ones are new, but we expect attrition will probably net that number out over time.
All right, thank you. And I just want to voice my concern about making these commitments to which Senator Funfar alluded, both in terms of the promises we make and also creating new positions that we're paying for out of federal dollars that are going to go away. But thank you so much. And thank you, Chair Scanlon.
Representative Devlin, followed by Representative Farrar.
Representative Devlin, we can't hear you.
Not yet. All right, we're going to come back to you, Representative Devlin. Hang on one sec. Let's see what Representative Farrar first, then we can come back to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Chair Scanlon. And thanks, everyone. Thanks to OPM for being here today. Really appreciate it. And to kind of a little bit of the proposals that were brought to us today. I know we might have kind of seen the more recent news on this pandemic affecting our poorest residents. And I'm curious to hear, Jeff, from you or folks on your team, what of the tax proposals from the governor do you see as being targeted at our lowest income and middle income residents? Right now, those individuals pay a disproportionate share of taxes compared to the wealthiest of our state. And I just would like to understand kind of how you see these tax proposals as alleviating that.
Well, certainly the initiative with the coronavirus relief funds in December and the proposed initiative for ARPA funds in the current fiscal year around the EITC eligible households is obviously those are lower income folks who nevertheless do work and do pay sales tax, and they get the earned income tax credit. And if they were eligible for that, the governor has made available in two installments payments to them, economic assistance payments to those individuals. Lower income and middle income people do own cars. They do pay the car tax. That's a break for those people as well. Those are at least two items. Obviously, we have a robust Health and Human Services budget on the approach side that takes care of a variety of needs for people that I would commend you to. The pensions and annuities, I'm among the seniors who would be paying taxes on their pension annuities. There are doubtless some who are lower income. And certainly the student loan tax credit is also an assistance to some folks who are probably of modest means who nevertheless have a student loan. But if they have an employer who's helping them with that, we're going to facilitate that with that initiative. So we think it's a broad-based set of proposals, and hopefully it will be meaningful, impactful for as many taxpayers.
Thanks, Jeff. And on the note around the proposal around the property tax credit, right now the proposal would be non-refundable. Could you speak to if we made it refundable, that it actually could ensure that our lowest income residents are included?
Well, you're talking about an additional tax break against the personal income tax, which we are admittedly proposing to increase one that we have. Going further on that, we've historically resisted those because that is our workhorse tax. It is the largest single source of revenue to the state. You'd be making an additional. And I would also comment that the personal income tax here is already fairly progressive. The exemptions that you have at the lower levels don't even subject you to tax until you get to a certain level. Tom Fiore's on the line. He probably has at the top of his head what those levels are, but it's a steeply progressive tax now.
Sure. Yeah, I just am concerned of hearing from folks who would fall below the threshold to actually qualify for the current property tax credit. So that's what I'm kind of mindful of, if how we can kind of make it and ensure that our lowest income residents are being able to get that credit. So I appreciate that and would be happy to follow up with some of the details you offered. But I actually do just have kind of another question. In looking at the proposal for the Department of Revenue Services, one of the things I noted was there was inclusion of a proposal to impose a 10-year statute of limitations on collecting outstanding taxes. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about the rationale for that. I think, for all of us, for folks that are avoiding paying taxes, that's something, we want to ensure isn't happening. And I know in our state, it's estimated we could be losing billions of dollars every year due to a tax gap of payment. So could you speak to that rationale of imposing that statute of limitations?
30-second reminder.
You're
So
speaking,
sorry.
Yep, you're speaking to the Department of Revenue Services Agency legislative proposal, which we did screen, and I do recall that. I think that is a time limit for uncollectible claims, if I'm not mistaken. I know you'll have an opportunity, if you raise that bill, to have the department come before you and explain how that works now and why they think that that's a appropriate change. It's not an OPM governor's bill, it's a DRS agency bill. But I believe it was around uncollectible claims. Tom, I don't know if you remember the details of that proposal.
Sure. That's exactly what it was, Jeff. And the agency will be there to explain it. But that's after all administrative appeals have been exhausted at the department, and the department has been unsuccessful in collecting any of that back due taxes. So, and it's an attempt, I think, by the department to clear away any of that uncollectible taxes off their books as part of their agency legislative proposal.
And that's
Thanks, Jeff and Tom, and thank you, Bree. Really appreciate it.
I see Representative Devlin is back. Representative Devlin, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
We got you.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that. Really, I had a question that came to me as I was listening to the discussion with Senator Fonfara and with Jeff, and Representative Cheeseman hit on it a little bit, and I would really like to get some clarification, because what I believe I heard, clearly there are some longer term fiscal implications with this proposal. And what I thought I heard Jeff say was that, yes, but we basically ignore that. We only look at 2023. And in addition, there were comments made that, deficits are a chronic problem with this state, which I thought we weren't necessarily using those terms anymore. And hopefully we're in better fiscal shape. But that my takeaway from that dialogue was, yes, we've created a proposal that has longer term implications, but we're going to ignore those for now. And the deficits that we may encounter as a result are just something to be expected. So I'm really hoping that my interpretation of that conversation is inaccurate, and I would love for some validation.
Well, let me start by saying we absolutely do not ignore the long-term implications of the proposals that we recommend to the governor, and he certainly isn't ignoring the long-term implications of what he's recommending to you. What I was simply commenting on is that it's simply a historical fact that we have had in almost every year, the last 20 or 30 years, structural budget deficits. We have a chronic problem of our expenditures outrunning our revenue. It's something we have to grapple with every year. And we absolutely calibrated the recommendations to the governor, and he made his decisions to you, trying to calibrate minimizing the impact on the long-term structural deficit. As I said, we tried to, in programming ARPA allocations, we tried to program them to the greatest extent possible to one-time expenditures using one-time revenue, so that we wouldn't have a cliff or an ongoing obligation. In some cases, we tried to, as I say, for the Treasury rules, calibrate the tax relief proposals such that they would meet those Treasury rules in a fiscally conservative way, not wanting to roll the dice with federal court cases that may excuse higher expenditures. We were trying to stay within the Treasury rules as we understood them. We've approached this from a fiscally conservative posture, and the governor has proposed to you a fiscally responsible and fiscally conservative approach. We will have to grapple next year when we propose a new biennial budget, or whoever's sitting in this seat proposes a new biennial budget, and they will have to grapple with what we are currently projecting revenues will be and what we currently projecting current services will require. But as I indicated, those things changed over time. This is simply a plan for 23. We'll have to, at the end of this year, give you a plan for the next biennium, and we'll have to grapple with all of those issues. But no one's ignoring long-term implications. We have those in mind every day at OPM. And we commend to you and to the committee that you should carefully consider those long-term implications as well.
If I may add to that, Mr. Undersecretary, a couple of the proposals that we have offered were intentionally designed to accelerate existing revenue tax cuts that are on the books so that they don't add to out-year deficits. For instance, the eligibility under the property tax credit and the pension annuities exemption. Those are already existing tax cuts. They're already factored into the consensus revenue forecast for the out years. We simply accelerated the effective date, if you will, to this year, so it doesn't really add to the out year impact. And the second thing I would add is based on our November fiscal accountability reports, both OFA and OPM have projected that over the longer term, our revenue growth and our fixed cost growth are converging, so that we believe that these are sustainable over the near term.
You know, I appreciate those answers, although I'm afraid that it validated maybe my worst fear. And this is exactly why we put in the structural reforms in the 2017 budget that have allowed our state to get into a more solid fiscal condition. So I'm really concerned about what has been presented, but I thank you for answering my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Cabros DeGraw, followed by Representative Piscopo.
Thank you. My question is in regard to the IRAs and the fact that they won't be included in the phase-out schedule. I'm pretty sure I know the reason why. But my concern is, and I hear a lot from the seniors in my district, that they're often encouraged to convert their 401ks to IRAs, which is why I brought this forward last year. And I'm grateful that we were able to at least start including the phase-out. But there's a lot of people who are going to be left behind if they have not converted to 401ks, and they still have to be on that phase out schedule. So I'm guessing I know the reason, but reason being why they were left out again.
Well, they're as your good work and the work of the General Assembly, they are being provided for over time. That exemption will come forward in a phased in schedule over 4 years. We did not get to that one to accelerate it as well because we have limited tools in the toolkit. We have a limited amount of funds that we could spend. We chose the ones that we thought were most impactful and helpful. We can't fund every good idea. We can't fund every great exemption. We had to make choices. As one of your staff said to one of our staff last week, you have the baton. So you may make different choices. This is the governor's recommendations. We look forward to working with you on finding a way forward for all of our citizens.
Thank you. I do appreciate the response.
Representative Piscopo, followed by Representative Doucette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Undersecretary Beckham. It's good to see you. You did a great job.
Thank you, sir. It's good to see you.
I was wondering about your capital side of the budget. You mentioned some expenses, and STEEP seems to be just laying out there with some unallocated balances. Is there any? Has there been any effort or attention paid to the STEEP funding? As ranking member of that bonding subcommittee, you could imagine that I'm getting approached by caucus members with very great projects that would help the state out, their region, and then the whole state out. And STEEP seems to be a good place to turn somebody, with a small expenditure. Is there any attention being paid to STEEP this fiscal year?
Yeah, Senator Representative, we do periodically do STEEP rounds of disbursements. We have someone in our agency who's one of her main jobs is to talk to towns all the time about their STEEP grants and to document those and to get those lined up. I don't happen to know where we are in the STEEP rounds of allocations at the moment. Perhaps Brian, or I think Martin Heft is on the line as well, may have an angle on the STEEP question. We can certainly get you more detail about where we are with STEEP allocations, but those are an ongoing program that I know we pay a lot of attention to.
Thank you, and I would appreciate that. We could probably do that during the bonding subcommittee.
Sure.
And the other thing was the the cap, if you will, on the amount of steep allocations. They were traditionally $500,000, and OPM has decreased it over the years to a little over $100,000. Is there? I'm sure there was a reason why, but is there any thought to maybe going with the traditional $500,000 allocation on for our small towns?
I'll have to look into that matter. I can only assume that to the extent that there was a cap or a ratcheting down of a cap, it was to try and spread that money around. As you know, it's not a large pot of money. It does go to our smaller towns. There was probably some desire at some point to spread it around a little bit more. That's the only thing I can think of, but let me look into that and get back to you on that one.
Thank you.
Undersecretary Beckham, I could probably answer that for you.
That's great.
So good afternoon. Thank you. So the state statutes for STEEP allow up to $500,000 within a fiscal year. So a municipality can apply to up to that amount depending upon available funds. So it is not a given that it's a grant awarded amount of 500,000. It's up to 500,000. This past in 2020, the STEEP grant we had $15 million in order to get out. Because of COVID, the governor's office and OPM decided that we wanted to get money to all eligible municipalities so they would all have an opportunity to get some of the funds. There was over, I want to say 100 or about eligible towns. It was over 100. We did provide funds to 98 municipalities of the $128,000, which was the cap on this one because of the available funds for that. That was for this program only. Each time there's a round, we look at how much the available funds are, but so we do look at that. But I appreciate those comments and those concerns.
Thank you, Secretary Heft. I appreciate it, and thank you for your communication over the year. You've been very, very responsive. Last question is on the broadband. I saw it as part of $100 million or so from ARPA, but then again, under Secretary Beckham, I saw him in your presentation on the capital budget, another 100, it looked like, in capital bonding. Is there a regional plan to get that up to our smaller towns, maybe in the corners of our state, or maybe we could go over this again in subcommittee, but I think I saw it in two different places. Can you clarify quickly for the committee?
30 seconds.
The broadband initiative is being run out of a couple of agencies, principally DEEP, I believe. And you're right, there are several pots of money that are available for broadband. We'll try to get you an aggregate number and where the plan is, particularly for your region of the state. But there is a big push, and we are in the midst of finalizing all those plans. We'll get you that detail.
Thank you, Undersecretary Beckham, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the hopes on Secretary McCaw feeling better. Please give her my thoughts on her best. Thank you.
We'll do that. We thank you. If I may, that was Martin Haftley, members of the committee. He's our Undersecretary for Intergovernmental Policy, former municipal official himself, and he's with us at OPM now working on a variety of grant programs to municipalities and the STEEP program, which is a bond-funded grant program.
Thank you, Undersecretary. Representative Doucette, followed by Representative Meskers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Jeff. Good to see you. Just a quick question. I think it's a quick question. Bring you back to the first few slides with the general fund summaries. I'm wondering and looking for more detail about the line item for reduced reliance on ARPA. There's a big chunk for FY22, and then there's a $250 million revenue loss for FY23. I'm wondering if you could explain how that number is calculated, whether or not that's variable over the course of the year or dependent on other factors. If you could just give a little more detail on that.
Well, that's our proposal on how to use those ARPA funds. They were programmed in the allocation plan for 23, the $250 million for revenue replacement. We're proposing, or the governor's proposing instead, to use it for near-term investments and to use the surplus to fund balance. So we don't need the $250 from the feds to balance our budget in 23. We're going to allow that to go forward for expenditures. It will leave, as we note on slide 7, about $945 million in ARPA funds that we will be relying on for revenue replacement in FY23. The transfer out of 22, the $560 million, means that there is no use of federal funds to balance the current fiscal year, which is FY22. We are not relying at all in the current fiscal year for revenue replacement. We've moved all of it out and are making it available for expenditures, if that makes sense.
Okay, so that maybe it's more of an appropriation side question, in other words, in terms of how those funds could be utilized?
Yes. We've detailed the new ARPA allocation plans to the Appropriations Committee last week, and that's where those funds are going. We're going to spend them on mostly one-time items, and for allowable uses under ARPA.
Okay, so then in terms of revenue replacement, the choice is to use it as you've outlined here, or to find other expenditures on the appropriation side. Is that
those are two uses for ARPA, yes. And we still have a need with current projections. We still have a need, as I say, to use about $945 million for revenue replacement in fiscal year 23, and we have programmed that in. But we have moved $250 million previously programmed as revenue replacement to expenditure.
Okay. And does that include, last question, does that include potential tax expenditure subject to the Treasury rules? I mean, could it be construed that way as well?
Short answer is yes.
Okay.
Subject to the Treasury rules is the most important thing you just said, though.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Well, that kind of clears it up for me, and I think perhaps some questions for our colleagues on the appropriation side as well, and we got to work closely together and understand, drill down on that a little more. I think it's important. That's a big number, obviously.
Yes,
okay,
sir.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Meskers, followed by Representative Wood, and then Representative Claris Tetro.
So first off, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I want to thank you for the presentation. I guess in broad strokes, it's pretty clear, looks pretty ambitious. I think the efforts the governor's made in presenting us with a budget, the outline of the resources and services he's trying to both provide to the state are extraordinary. So I thank him, and I thank you for the effort in the presentation. Two things that would be helpful to me. One is the IRA impact, and I understand what the concerns are there. So, an acceleration on IRA exemption on pension income. If I could get an idea of the fiscal side of that. And in your presentations over the last 2 years, I guess if I were to find fault conceptually where I'm trying to get to, is I need to understand the standing point going back over 10 or 20 years of what represented fixed costs versus, if you will, operational expenditures for the state. As I sat there and looked at our pension obligations and our unfunded liabilities, we went from basically 38% fixed income, if you will, or fixed cost servicing to about, and 62 discretionary, that we peaked out at about 51% are fixed costs versus the discretionary spending of the state. So I know now that with these two pay downs, you described 1.6 billion for this past fiscal year and 1.2 in the future. That should free up about 300 million of operating revenue for expenditures. I just wonder where we are in a ratio of those fixed costs versus I think it's important for all of us to understand that the debt service and pay down of the debt is what's going to free up money for the social services and for the operations of the state. So a ratio there it would help me to look at that every year to know, are we ahead of the ball, behind the ball on where we are on those fixed costs? Debt service, right?
Representative Meskers, I think we can count on you to ask a very hard math question, and I'm sure my colleagues in the budget division can put that exhibit together for you. of the ratio of those costs. But you're absolutely right about that. The extent to which we can pay down some of these long-term obligations, it will free up money for the operational side of the budget. Absolutely. That's in concept, that much I can tell you. What the numbers exactly are, I will get you some exhibits on that topic.
Yeah. I mean, I'm only going to be in service till my teeth fall out, and so I won't be here forever. And I think it's important for all of us as the legislature and as a governing body to look at the state's fiscal position as what's sustainable over time. And I think this governor has done a tremendous job to bend the arc to try to get to a fiscally sustainable budget. And now the question is, when can we get the benefits of that? Right? There is light at the end of the tunnel, but I think we're still at that tipping point of about 50-50 on expenditures versus, and people need to understand that the fiscal savings, we're not just throwing them away, it's presiding, I was told by, I think OPM, it's about that $3 billion would generate about $300 million of operational cash flow that we could actually spend. So paying down the debt has a short-term benefit in terms of the operating budget. Right.
My colleague, the executive budget officer, Mr. Batamianos, is on. Paul, do you have some comments to that detail?
Well, I will note that Representative Meskers is exactly right, that as we pay down our pension debt, for instance, it does free up cash for other investments in the budget. And the enacted budget for the biennium, fiscal years 22 and 23, includes savings that were anticipated at the time the budget was adopted relative to these additional payments, additional pension payments. So there's a piece of that already built into the budget. As these, we talked about the potential for another $1.2 billion in additional pension deposits at the end of 23. Those would be captured in future valuations of our pension plan, and then would translate into what our required payments are into the pension fund. And again, to the extent there's favorability that would be captured in terms of our reduced requirement for ADEC payments by the state, and then would be translated into the legislature's desires for how those funds would be invested over time.
30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's it for me. I think we're moving towards a sustainable Connecticut, and I think your budgets are helping us get there. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Claris Tetra, followed by Representative Borer. As a reminder, that brings us as of now to the end of the first round. If anyone has not asked a question in this round and wants to, please raise your hand. If not, anyone who has already asked one, now's the time to get that hand up, because otherwise we're going to shut this thing down. So Representative Claris Tetra, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation today. My question goes to the mill rate cap on motor vehicles. Are these numbers an estimate, or are they hard numbers? Because some of my municipal CEOs are calculating these numbers and coming up with deficits on these numbers that we see here today.
You're speaking to the 160 million that we calculate to be the amount to keep them whole?
Correct.
Is Mike Azadi on the line?
Yes, hello.
Mike, what did we base the 160 million on?
So those grant
so Michael, if you would introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Azadi. I'm a budget specialist for the Office of Policy and Management. Those grant calculations are based on the most recent available data to OPM as of the grant payment date, which is prior year data. As I understand, this is consistent with how other municipal aid grants are distributed, and any changes in grant lists or revaluations, any changes like that would be captured the following year of the grant payment.
I would simply add that it is the governor's commitment that the towns be made whole for this change that we're proposing. So if there is any adjustment that needs to be made to that number, we're certainly prepared to work with OFA to make sure the number is the correct number.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Representative Borer.
Thank you, Representative Scanlon. Actually, I think my ranking on bonding committee, Representative Piscopo, really asked most of the questions that I was going to ask. I just want to make a follow-up comment that our bonding subcommittee will be holding a meeting in early March with OPM. That'll be a public meeting. Everybody on the finance committee will be invited, and there'll be an opportunity to further discuss any of the capital questions that we see here this morning.
Thank you, Representative Boer.
One question that I received via text message from probably an interested mayor was, what year is the car tax cap based on? And that is important to some of these towns, obviously, given that some of them are undergoing revals. So do you all know which year it's based on?
Michael.
Hi, yes. So the grant calculations in the proposed budget are based on the current fiscal year's data. OPM does not, as I understand, have the data for the following year until after the grant payment is due, and therefore revaluations as proposed would be picked up in the following year's grant payment. But the calculations proposed are based on fiscal year FY22 data.
Okay, so if you're a taxpayer and you are watching this with great interest, your car tax mill rate would be based on FY22 for the FY23 car tax year. And then going forward, it would change every year based on whatever the local situation is. Is that correct, Mike?
So the FY22 data is used to calculate the grant payment to towns coming from the state as proposed. The 29 mil cap on car taxes would just apply to the same principle that is used to calculate the tax levy for the town. So that would be using grand list data for the current fiscal year whenever the tax levy occurs. So on July 1st, the tax bill that goes out would be based on the July 1st, 2022 tax bill would be based on the October 1st, 2021 grant list, as is normal practice for towns.
Right. So if you are watching this, it's whatever, like every year, October 1, whatever was going on at that time is what the tax is based on for July.
Correct.
Even if you are giving them more substantial reimbursement, should your proposal pass, nothing would change from their perspective. If they've done a reval, that's just something that is sort of a happenstance to this whole situation, correct?
Correct. There's no proposal to change the grand list of towns as revals are occurring, et cetera. The proposal should not disrupt that in any way. Gotcha. It's just that due to the process of receiving data at OPM calculating these grants, there would be a 1-year delay in when those reimbursements would reach the towns.
But your grants are based on October 1, 2021. For this coming fiscal year, should this pass?
They're based on the audited data we have for October 1, 2020.
2020. Okay, got it.
But that doesn't affect the tax levy on the town side.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Representative Cheeseman.
So quick question. This has to do with the infrastructure funding. I know when in our presentation from DOT, it was indicated they hadn't had the notice of funding opportunities for a lot of the things. One, how much of this is straight outright grants to the state and how much of it is competitive? And two, if there are delays in receiving, how this is going to play out, is the assumption that the feds will then move out the deadlines for spending, and how would that affect how this is going to be rolled
out? Our colleagues at DOT could probably give you more detail about those particular programs. Paul, do we have anyone on the line about?
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeff, that's a question the DOT will have to answer. There is a proportion of those funds that are grant-based, another proportion that's competitive. I don't have that information.
So are all of the other ones you indicated straight out grants as opposed to having a competitive element? Because we've got, looking at the water and the broadband and those sort of things. Can you shed some light on that?
There are elements of both formula and competitive to both. I would say that I think our slide detailed.
Yeah,
ahead.
our slide 35 did indicate what we thought our match requirements were going to be. So there was a little bit more on the competitive side, although those are actually unknown. We will need to get more information from the federal government, but we were programming 100 million in terms of a state match for the competitive grants and 80 million for the formula grants. Greater detail about how they roll out and what's covered was probably a better put to the Department of Transportation.
Okay, and
Hey,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, this is Brian Tassinari from Office Policy Management. We've estimated approximately how much is going to be received in competitive and formula grants. Right now, DOT can probably give you a better idea, but we're estimating about $1 billion of competitive, and that can range in terms of the match requirement somewhere between 20 to 50%. The formula would be the remainder, so about 1.6 billion, and we're assuming a match of about 20%.
And the assumption on the competitive grants is, of course, that we're awarded those competitive grants.
Right. It's just an estimate because you don't get them until you qualify for it. So we have to make the, yeah.
Is this based on historical performance by the state of Connecticut, or
yeah,
if these are new funding programs, or is this just your best case scenario?
I would say this is based on their prior experience in obtaining competitive grants. They felt that $1 billion was a fairly normal amount based on the amount that's available.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Scanlon.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you, Chairman Scanlon. I think Brian just did a great job outlining the answer to the good ranking member's question. DOT did provide a detailed analysis of opportunities at last week's Transportation Committee hearing. They have a robust presentation that they provided to us that I think would be really informative to members of this committee as a whole. So I'll have DOT forward that to our members, and Chairman Scanlon, it probably would be useful to send that out to every member of this committee. It does go into great detail what we would expect under prior allotments, prior grant awards, how we traditionally stand in our applications, and the meritorious nature of our application. So I think the good ranking member can be assured that it's a fairly conservative estimate that OPM has used in providing this analysis to us today, but the details of that were all included in that presentation. I will ensure that it gets to the Finance Committee, and I'm sure our administrator can forward it out to every member. Thanks again.
Thank you, Representative. We certainly will share that with the committee. Seeing no further hands, on behalf of the committee, I will thank you and the entire OPM team for your time and presentation this morning. Echo what has been said by some of our members about Secretary McClaw's health. We certainly wish her the best. And I thank you in advance for answering any further questions our members may have as we work through this presentation. And I know I speak for Senator Fonfara and I when we say that we have a lot of questions, and we look forward to working with you and the Secretary to get those answered in the coming weeks and months. With that, we will close out this meeting, and I thank you all, and we'll see you on Friday morning at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.